Like many cities, New Orleans experienced several transit strikes, but the 1929 streetcar strike proved to be one of the most violent in U.S. history. Motormen and conductors were so familiar to riders that their strike aroused public support across neighborhood and class lines. After simmering for many years, conflict between New Orleans Public Service and the Carmen's Union reached a crisis, not over wages, but over the union losing control it had possessed since World War I. Company officials formed a rival union, and the two unions fought with one another over members.
Basically, the strike was over employee versus employer control. Who was going to control the hiring, who was hired, who was going to control advancement, the assignment of routes, and this kind of thing. I think basically a question of union and union shop versus complete control of the company by the administrators of the company. The 1920s had a very strong open shop movement, and the National Association of Manufacturers was heavily engaged in supporting that and promoting that. So what happened in New Orleans in the 1920s was not at all unique.
Public service was well financed to face the strikers, who walked out on July the 1st. The streetcars, it turned out, would not run again regularly for more than 2 weeks, and then only during the day. Enterprising citizens operated illegal taxis called Jitneys. Jitney was slang for a nickel, the original cost of a ride. During the strike, most jitney operators charged a dime. Drivers tried to sidestep the law banning unlicensed cabs by asking passengers to leave the fare on the seat.
Some jitneys were just ordinary automobiles. Some of them were kind of odd looking. They'd have an open truck, and they'd have benches in the bed of the truck, and the people would sit on the benches, and they'd ride them to Canal Street or wherever they were going, you know.
A train filled with 400 strikebreakers reached New Orleans on the 4th of July. A sympathetic telegraph operator gave the strikers advance warning. The carmen hurried to ambush the strikebreakers as they disembarked 2 blocks from the Canal Street car barn. John Bain was a transit engineer assigned to manage the strikebreakers.
As they came in, strikers on the rooftops of the one-story houses on both sides of the street they were marching on had gathered up all the bricks from the sidewalks around the place, and they hurled those bricks down on the strikebreakers and bloodied them up pretty badly.
Police fired shots in the air to disperse the hundreds of strikers and sympathizers who were battling strikebreakers outside the streetcar barn.
We saw one of the strikers get hit and tumble over. He later died, hit in the stomach. Accidentally, I'm sure, because he was the only one that was killed. And that sort of quieted all of the strikers and their sympathizers. It quieted them down.
The fatalities are strikers. They're not strike breakers. A lot of strike breakers were beaten or were injured with flying objects.
But that night they again came around Canal Barn and the bus garage, and they threw rags soaked in gasoline. They threw them over the fence, trying to catch the cars or buses on fire. Firemen were pretty slow getting to the fires, by the way, because I think, this is my opinion, that they sort of sympathized with the strikers. So did the police, other than the officers of the police department.
The next day, the first streetcars operated by strikebreakers triggered even greater violence. The crowd showered bricks and stones upon the streetcars as police fired shotgun blasts from inside. Newspapers reported that 10,000 people surrounded one of the cars after it was abandoned downtown.
when the car reached the foot of canal, it was attacked by the crowd down there. The driver ran away, and the crowd then demolishes the car. Nopsey sent a truck down to the foot of Canal Street, which was probably not too wise, to try and rescue the car.
John Bain led the rescue attempt.
All the time they were throwing rocks at us through the platform, and some of them firing guns at us. One of my helpers was hit in the head with a rock or some hard piece of material. And they found out at the main office that we were down there and sent a police squad over to pick us up and make us leave before we really got hurt. It was a real hairy time.
The first thought that came to my mind when I saw this crowd was the French Revolution. It says, this is the French Revolution on Louisiana soil. That was my personal reaction.
After burning the streetcar, the crowd attacked the repair truck.
They set the truck on fire, and then eventually they tried to shove the truck back up Canal Street to Baronne. They were going to try and jam it into the entrance of the Nopsey building on Baronne Street.
Throughout the city, reaction against the arrival of strikebreakers was so strong that crowds tore rails from the ground and blocked the tracks with timbers and rocks. Women stoned buildings that housed strikebreakers. Thousands of people gathered around each of the city's 5 streetcar barns to prevent other streetcars from running. Transit officials turned to the federal government for help.
Injunctions were often used to cripple strikes, to weaken the effectiveness of union protest. In this case, after the initial acts of violence, the company was able to get an injunction that limited the number of strikers who were striking and who were picketing to 3 at a time.
A congressional investigation later revealed that Nopsey had contracted with strike-breaking firms that stockpiled weapons and tear gas. Many of the strike-breakers hired were career criminals, including one who testified that some strike-breakers earned the then extraordinary sum of $50 per day.
They'd collect the fares. Remember, they were 7-cent fares way back in those days. And they'd collect the fares, but they'd keep them in their pocket. They wouldn't hand them in. We overlooked all that.
If you saw the strikebreakers as defenders of private property and private enterprise, you might have a more positive reaction toward them. But the working people, I think, thought of them as kind of paid mercenaries who were taking the work of good New Orleanians, and they were Yankees to boot.
300 men, including many strikebreakers, were deputized by U.S. Marshal Victor Loisel to guard the streetcars and enforce the federal injunction, which was posted on each car. When the streetcars resumed service, few passengers rode.
I think perhaps more than the actual participation in the protest or the violent events, the solidarity that accompanied the strike in terms of people boycotting the streetcars. And this, for people, was a real hardship because most people had no other way to get to work. So it meant personal hardship.
Mass violence subsided, but occasional attacks on streetcars kept them from running after dark.
The public was all for the carmen, and dare not, nobody would dare not ride the streetcar. Number one, I suppose they were in favor of the carmen. They were in sympathy. And number two, I guess they were fearful of the fact that some of the strikers or some of the people who were on the side of the strikers would brickbat the streetcars. There was a danger. And I knew this young man, and he got out with the crowd enthusiastically and threw a rock, a brick, went through the window, and the U.S. Marshals grabbed him, and he served maybe 6 months.
Small businesses donated goods and services to the strikers. Both black and white unions donated money. Practically everyone took a side.
I don't mean to put them down because they were good neighbors, you know, for the city of New Orleans. But in this particular case, they were a powerful group that was kind of oppressing the downtrodden and the hard-working people that worked for the public service, the conductors and the motormen, the carmen.
Some local trade unions called for a general strike, but the carmen were confident that they would win by maintaining the boycott. Success hinged upon their efforts to legalize the jitneys as a rival transit system, and a petition drive led to a riot at City Hall in August. The anti-jitney ordinance was not repealed, another blow to the strikers. Sympathizers began to place dynamite on streetcar tracks.
I was going home. Yeah, I was riding a streetcar big as hell. I was the only one on there, I think. And all of a sudden, the floorboards started flying up. And then you had this racket. They put dynamite, and of course, the streetcar set the dynamite off. Scared the living hell out of me. At that time, I was living with my mother. When I got home, she says, "What's the matter, son? You don't look right." I said, "I'm not right. They blew the streetcar off that I was on." "I told you not to ride those streetcars." I said, "Mom, I make my living riding those streetcars. Don't tell me that. I've got to do it."
Nopsey rejected a compromise settlement proposed by Mayor T. Semmes Walmsley. The strikers later refused to accept a settlement negotiated between their union's national president and public service, because several hundred strikers were barred from returning, and those who were allowed to return would lose their seniority. Some strikers later accepted Nopsey's terms, but many vainly tried to establish a rival transit service. They held benefit dances well into the 1930s. The union had been broken, but the strike left its scars.
When it was all over, the company thought they'd won. I always wondered, of all the millions they spent on that strike, whether they won or not, but it wasn't for me to decide.
I know of a case where this man was a carman for maybe 30 years, and he went on strike in 1929, and never went back and swore that he would never go back. He would rather die.
Years later, two men from opposite sides of the strike found themselves working as elevator operators in the same building.
I said, "Why do you hate this man so much?" Because everybody else liked him, you know. "He's a no-good scab." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "During the streetcar strike, he was one of the replacement drivers. He knocked us out of our jobs." And he went on and on and on. And this was the 1960s, and this man was still in an absolute rage about the strike breakers. And so they had a personal vendetta going, these two old men.
The strike never ended. I guess you could say they're still on strike.